The exact reality you fear the most, and the life of extreme freedom you have always dreamed of, are already happening simultaneously at this very millisecond. The conflict is that you are exhausted, trying to reach a finish line that has already been crossed. If modern physics states that linear time is an illusion, why do you keep sacrificing your energy today to try to force a tomorrow that already exists? Pause for a second and notice your body, right now. Not your plans, not your past, just this moment. There's a subtle tension, a quiet pressure to become something, to get somewhere. That pressure has been driving you for years, and yet it never really ends. What if the problem isn't your effort, but where your attention is anchored? Right now, ask yourself, what am I postponing that I could feel even for a moment today? Because the shift doesn't start in the future. It starts in how you experience this exact second. You know that horrible feeling of watching the years pass too quickly, pushing yourself to the limit, yet your life seems stuck in the same place. We were taught to believe that time is a relentless line, where success is a distant and painful destination we must chase, leaving us with that constant pressure in our chest that we are falling behind. It shows up in quiet moments, when you see someone your age doing better, when a random memory reminds you how fast a decade disappeared, when you wake up already tired, not from what you did, but from what you think you should have done by now. There's this subtle voice measuring everything, your progress, your choices, your worth, against an invisible clock that never seems to slow down. But here's the strange part. No one ever agreed on where that clock actually starts or ends. Still, most people obey it without question. You were trained to. School gave you timelines, society gave you milestones. By a certain age, you should have this figured out, that secured, this achieved. And if you don't, the conclusion feels automatic. You're late. Not just delayed, but somehow off track in a way that feels personal. That feeling isn't neutral. It creates tension in your body. It makes your decisions heavier. It turns simple choices into loaded ones, because now every step carries the weight of catching up. Even rest starts to feel suspicious, like you're wasting time instead of recovering energy. And the more you buy into this pressure, the more your perception narrows. You stop seeing possibilities and start seeing deadlines. You stop exploring and start calculating. Life becomes less about experiencing and more about measuring. This is where the illusion quietly tightens its grip. Because what feels like urgency is often just repetition. The same thoughts, the same comparisons, the same internal narrative looping over and over again, creating the sensation of movement while nothing fundamentally changes. You feel busy, even overwhelmed, but not necessarily aligned. Effort increases, clarity decreases. There's also a hidden contradiction in all of this. You're told to trust the process, but at the same time, you're constantly reminded that time is running out. So you end up in a strange mental state where you're trying to be patient while also feeling late. That tension alone is enough to drain your energy before anything meaningful even begins. And then comes the quiet frustration. Why does it feel like I'm doing everything right, but nothing is shifting? The answer isn't as simple as working harder or waiting longer. In fact, both of those often reinforce the same pattern, because the issue isn't just what you're doing, it's the state you're doing it from. When your actions are driven by the belief that you're behind, everything you do carries that signal. Your mind stays focused on what's missing. Your body stays slightly tense. Your attention becomes selective, filtering reality through lack instead of possibility. Opportunities can exist right in front of you, but they don't register because they don't match the story you're telling yourself. This is how the illusion sustains itself, not through force, but through repetition. And it's subtle. You might call it responsibility, discipline, ambition. But underneath, there's often a quiet fear of not making it in time. That fear doesn't just sit in the background, it shapes how you see everything. Even your goals start to feel heavier. Instead of pulling you forward with excitement, they begin to feel like obligations you're trying to catch up to. The future stops being something you're moving toward and starts feeling like something that's moving away from you. That's when time begins to feel like an opponent. But what if that entire sensation, the rushing, the pressure, the feeling of being late, is not a reflection of reality, but a distortion created by how you've been taught to interpret it. What if the problem isn't that you're behind, but that you've been measuring yourself against a timeline that was never truly yours? And more importantly, what if there's a specific, almost invisible habit that keeps reinforcing this feeling every single day, without you even noticing it? What almost no one realizes is that there is an invisible trap, a behavior so common that you probably repeated it today when you woke up, and it mathematically cancels the arrival of this new reality. I will explain how to deactivate this self-sabotaging mechanism in a moment, but first, you need to face the harsh consequence of continuing to operate this way blindly. It doesn't look like a mistake. That's why it's so dangerous. It feels like thinking, planning, being responsible. It shows up as that automatic scan you do the moment your eyes open, checking your life against what is missing, what hasn't happened yet, what is still unresolved, what is still not there. And in that instant, before your feet even touch the ground, you have already defined the emotional tone of your entire day. You've told your mind and your body, "We are not there yet," and your system obeys. This is the silent error. Not your lack of effort, not your lack of talent, but the unconscious habit of starting every day reinforcing absence. You rehearse the gap so often that it begins to feel like truth, and once something feels true, your brain stops questioning it and starts organizing reality around it. This is how the illusion maintains control, not by hiding reality from you, but by training you to look at it through a very specific lens. Think about it. If you constantly focus on what is missing, your attention becomes tuned to detect more of what is missing. It's not that opportunities disappear, it's that they no longer match the pattern your mind is searching for. So they pass by unnoticed, like signals on a frequency you're not tuned into. And the more this happens, the more it confirms your original belief. See, it's still not working. That confirmation deepens the pattern. There's a kind of precision to this process. Your thoughts are not just random noise, they are instructions. Repeated often enough, they become expectations. And expectations subtly influence perception, decisions, and behavior, not in a dramatic way, but in small, almost invisible adjustments. The tone of your voice, the risks you avoid, the ideas you dismiss too quickly. Over time, these micro-adjustments compound. And what's frustrating is that from the outside, it still looks like you're trying. You're doing things, making plans, pushing forward, but underneath there's a contradiction. You're taking action while emotionally confirming that the result is not here. That split signal creates friction. It slows everything down. It's like pressing the gas and the brake at the same time, then wondering why the car isn't moving the way it should. This is why the error erases your destiny, not in some dramatic, mystical sense, but in a very practical way. It prevents alignment between what you want and how you consistently feel. And without that alignment, progress becomes unstable, inconsistent, and exhausting. You might even notice this pattern in how you talk to yourself. There's always a when. When this happens, then I'll relax. When I get there, then I'll feel secure. When things finally change, then I'll allow myself to breathe. But that when never really arrives the way you expect. Because each time you reach a milestone, your mind resets the target. It finds a new gap, a new condition, a new reason to delay that sense of completion. So the experience of not yet continues. This is where the illusion becomes almost invisible. It convinces you that the problem is external, time, circumstances, other people, while the internal pattern keeps repeating uninterrupted. And the cost of this isn't just emotional. It has a physical impact. Your body doesn't interpret your thoughts as abstract ideas. It responds to them as signals. When you constantly reinforce lack, your system stays slightly tense, slightly alert, as if something is wrong or incomplete. That low-level tension doesn't fade, it accumulates. You carry it into your decisions, your conversations, your work. It shapes how you show up without you even realizing it. And over time, it begins to feel normal, like this is just how life is supposed to feel. But it isn't. And here's where it becomes even more important to pay attention, because this same pattern that seems harmless in the morning doesn't stay contained. It starts triggering a chain reaction inside your body and mind, amplifying stress in ways that quietly affect everything you do next. The intensity increases because this invisible flaw doesn't just block your external progress, it destroys your nervous system. When you wake up focused on the lack of what hasn't happened yet, your body enters survival mode. This constant state of alert locks your vibration into a frequency of fear, making you blind to the exits that are already right in front of you. At first, it feels manageable, just a little pressure, a little urgency pushing you forward. But the body doesn't treat it as motivation, it treats it as threat. And once that switch is flipped, everything begins to change in subtle but powerful ways. Your breathing becomes shallow without you noticing. Your shoulders carry a slight tension that never fully releases. Your thoughts speed up, not with clarity, but with repetition. The same concerns circle again and again, as if trying to solve something that isn't actually being addressed at the root. This is how the domino effect begins. One thought of "I'm behind" turns into a feeling of pressure. That pressure signals your body to stay alert. That alertness narrows your focus, and that narrow focus filters your reality down to problems, risks, and what still isn't working. Each step feeds the next, creating a loop that feels logical from the inside, but limiting from the outside. You start reacting more than choosing. Small situations feel heavier than they should. A delay becomes proof that things aren't moving. A mistake feels like confirmation that you're off track. Even neutral moments begin to carry a negative weight because your system is already primed to expect friction. This is not because life suddenly became harder. It's because your internal state changed the way life is processed. And the illusion deepens here, because it convinces you that this heightened state is necessary. It whispers that if you relax, you'll fall even further behind. That if you stop scanning for problems, you'll miss something important. So you stay in this constant readiness, believing it's helping you stay in control. But control never really arrives. Only exhaustion does. The nervous system was not designed to stay in this prolonged state. It was built for short bursts of response, followed by recovery. When that recovery never comes, your baseline shifts. Stress stops feeling like an exception and starts feeling like your normal state. And from that state, your decisions begin to change. You become more cautious, even when opportunities require openness. You hesitate in moments that call for trust. You overanalyze simple choices, searching for certainty that doesn't exist. And without realizing it, you begin to trade expansion for safety. This is where many people unknowingly limit their own path, not because they lack potential, but because their system is no longer calibrated for growth. It's calibrated for protection. There's also a deeper cost that often goes unnoticed. When your body is in survival mode, it prioritizes immediate threats over long-term vision. Creativity decreases. Intuition becomes quieter. The ability to sense subtle opportunities fades into the background. You might still have ideas, but they feel distant, harder to access, less convincing. It's like trying to hear a whisper in a room full of noise. And yet, the response most people have to this is to push harder, to add more effort, more pressure, more urgency, thinking that intensity will break the cycle. But it only reinforces it, because the problem was never a lack of force. It was the state from which that force is being applied. This is why two people can take similar actions and get completely different results. One operates from tension, constantly reacting, forcing outcomes. The other moves from a more grounded state, noticing, adjusting, responding with clarity. The difference isn't in what they do, but in how their system is aligned while doing it. And that alignment is deeply affected by how they relate to time. If time feels like something chasing you, your body will always feel like it needs to run. If time feels scarce, your system will treat every moment as something that could be lost. But if that perception itself is part of the illusion, then everything built on top of it begins to distort. Because what if the stress you feel isn't coming from reality itself, but from the way reality has been framed inside your mind? What if time is not applying pressure to you, but you've been conditioned to generate that pressure from within? And if that's true, then escaping this chain reaction doesn't start with doing more. It starts with seeing time differently at its core, in a way that most people have never seriously considered. To escape this limiting prison, Einstein's theory of relativity offers a liberating answer. Time is not a flowing river. Past, present, and future coexist right now, like a complete film already recorded in what is called the block universe. The exact scene of your greatest victory already exists intact in space-time, simply waiting for the light of your consciousness to illuminate that coordinate. This idea can feel strange at first, almost abstract. You are taught to think of time as something that moves, something that carries you from one moment to the next. But in this view, nothing is actually moving in the way you imagine. Instead, every moment, what you call past, present, and future, is already positioned, like frames in a vast, unmoving structure. Imagine opening a book. Every page exists at once. The beginning, the middle, the ending. They are all there, complete. Yet your experience of the story feels sequential because you read one page at a time. The story doesn't unfold because it's being created as you go. It unfolds because your awareness is traveling through something that is already written. This changes the way you see your own life. Because if your future is not something being built from scratch, but something that already exists as a set of possibilities, then the pressure you feel begins to lose its foundation. The idea that you are running out of time starts to look less like reality and more like a deeply ingrained illusion. And this illusion has consequences. When you believe the future doesn't exist yet, you feel responsible for forcing it into existence. You try to control every variable, predict every outcome, avoid every mistake. But if the future is already part of the structure, then your role is not to create it through stress, but to align with it through awareness and choice. That shift is subtle but powerful. It moves you from force to orientation, from pushing to noticing, from trying to build something out of nothing to learning how to recognize where you are within something that already is. And here's where it becomes practical, not just theoretical. If all moments coexist, then the version of you who has already reached that point you desire is not imaginary. It is a coordinate within this larger structure, a real configuration of decisions, behaviors, and internal states that already exists in space-time. The question then becomes, what differentiates your current experience from that one? Not time, not luck, not some external permission. It's alignment. Your current thoughts, emotions, and actions determine which part of this structure you are tuned into. Just like a radio doesn't create music but selects a frequency that already exists, your awareness doesn't create reality from nothing. It locks into specific patterns that are already available. This is where many people misunderstand the process. They think they need to add something new to their lives, when in reality they may need to shift how they are perceiving and responding to what is already present. Because if you are constantly tuned to stress, urgency, and lack, you will continue experiencing the segments of reality that reflect those states. Not because you are being punished, but because that is the frequency you are aligned with. And the illusion reinforces itself here again. It tells you that changing your state is naive, that only external changes matter. But in a framework where all outcomes already exist, your internal state becomes the very mechanism that determines what you experience. This doesn't mean you stop acting. It means your actions come from a different place. Instead of acting from fear of what hasn't happened, you begin to act from a quiet certainty that something already exists and you are moving toward it. That certainty changes how you speak, how you decide, how you respond to uncertainty. It reduces the noise that used to cloud your perception. And when that noise decreases, something interesting begins to happen. You start noticing moments that feel slightly out of place in your old pattern, small signals, unexpected ideas, subtle opportunities that didn't stand out before. It's not that they suddenly appeared, it's that your awareness is no longer locked in the same narrow channel. This is where the experience becomes more personal, less conceptual, because once you begin to sense that your future is not as distant or as fragile as you thought, a new question naturally emerges. If that version of you already exists, and if alignment is the bridge, then how exactly does that connection happen? How can something that you call future influence what you are doing right now in this moment in a way that feels real and not imagined? This is where common sense completely shatters. In quantum mechanics, the phenomenon of retrocausality suggests that your future can directly influence your present. That sudden, unexplainable intuition that saves you from danger or gives you a brilliant idea out of nowhere. It's not random. It's your future self, already beyond the obstacles, sending a signal to guide you along the fastest path. At first, this sounds impossible because you've been trained to think in a straight line. Cause comes first, then effect. You act and then something happens, you decide and then results follow. But this model starts to break when you look closely at how many of your most important moments actually occur. Think about the times when you just knew something without having enough information. A decision that didn't make full logical sense at the time, but later proved to be exactly right. Or a moment when you felt a strong pull toward or away from something, and only afterward understood why. Those moments don't fit neatly into the traditional timeline. They feel like information arriving early. In a framework where all moments already exist, this becomes less mysterious. If your future is not being created but already positioned, then the version of you who has already navigated certain challenges carries information that you don't yet consciously have access to. And sometimes that information leaks through, not as a detailed explanation, but as a signal, a feeling, a hesitation, a sudden clarity. The problem is not that these signals are rare, the problem is that they are often ignored because they don't sound like logic. They don't come with step-by-step instructions, and they don't match the urgency-driven mindset shaped by the illusion of time. When you are operating under pressure, you tend to trust what is loud, immediate, and measurable. Subtle signals get dismissed because they don't feel solid enough, so you override them. You choose what seems practical in the moment, even if something deeper is telling you otherwise. And when things become harder later, it reinforces the belief that life is just unpredictable, when in reality, there may have been a quieter direction available all along. There's another layer to this. Even when you do notice these signals, you might doubt them. You question whether it's just wishful thinking, fear, or imagination. And that doubt creates hesitation. That hesitation breaks the flow of alignment, pulling you back into analysis and second-guessing. This is how the illusion maintains its structure. It doesn't block guidance. It trains you to mistrust it. But consider this. Your brain is constantly processing far more information than you are consciously aware of. Patterns, micro-expressions, subtle changes in your environment. What you call intuition may be a blend of this deep processing combined with something even more subtle, a form of internal alignment with a version of you that has already seen what's ahead. Not in a mystical, exaggerated sense, but in a functional way. It's like your system is trying to correct your path in real time, offering small adjustments that, if followed, would reduce friction, not eliminate challenges, but guide you through them more efficiently. And yet, the more stressed you are, the less access you have to this layer. Because stress narrows perception, it prioritizes immediate survival over long-term navigation. It makes you reactive instead of receptive, and in that state, even the clearest signal can be missed. So the connection between your present and your future isn't broken, it's just drowned out. This brings a different kind of responsibility, not the pressure to control everything, but the awareness that how you feel directly affects what you can perceive. If your state is chaotic, the signal gets lost in the noise. If your state is more stable, more open, those subtle directions become easier to recognize. You begin to notice patterns you missed before, repeated nudges, moments that feel slightly out of sequence as if they're trying to get your attention. And when you follow them, even in small ways, something shifts. The path doesn't necessarily become easier, but it becomes clearer, and clarity reduces resistance. This is where the idea of cause and effect starts to feel less rigid, because sometimes the effect, the feeling, the intuition, the inner knowing arrives before the visible cause, not to confuse you, but to guide you. But there is one habit that interferes with this process more than anything else, a habit so normalized that it's often mistaken for positivity, when in reality it keeps you disconnected from both clarity and alignment. And the more you rely on it, the more those signals from your future begin to fade into the background. And this is why that lethal mistake I mentioned earlier is so destructive, the act of hoping. When you place your hope in the idea that things will get better someday, You send a universal command that you are lacking now. Hope traps you in the waiting room of life, validating the absence and ensuring your future remains an unreachable mirage. It sounds harsh at first, because hope is usually seen as something positive, almost noble. You were taught to hold on to it, to rely on it when things feel uncertain, and in some situations, it can keep people moving. But when it becomes your default state, it quietly shifts your entire relationship with reality. Because hope in this form is always tied to distance. It places what you want somewhere ahead, somewhere not here yet. It creates a subtle gap between you and the experience you're trying to reach. And the longer you stay in that emotional position, the more real that gap begins to feel. You start to live as someone who is almost there, but never quite. Close, but not complete. Moving, but not arriving. And the illusion of time feeds on that gap. It tells you that this is normal, that life is supposed to feel like a constant pursuit, that fulfillment is always just a little further ahead. So you keep hoping, keep waiting, keep projecting your sense of peace into a future moment that never fully lands in the present. There's a quiet tension inside hope that often goes unnoticed. It carries a low-level dissatisfaction, a sense that something is missing right now. Even when you try to stay positive, that underlying message remains. This is not it yet. Your body hears that clearly. And just like before, your system responds. It doesn't organize itself around what you say you want. It organizes around what you consistently feel. If the dominant feeling is incompleteness, then your perception, your decisions, and your reactions begin to reflect that state. This is how hope, when misunderstood, becomes a loop. You hope for change because you feel lack. That feeling of lack shapes your state. That state influences your actions. And those actions, coming from that same state, often recreate the same results, which then reinforces the need to keep hoping. It looks like movement, but it's actually repetition. There's also a subtle passivity hidden inside this pattern. When you are hoping, you are often waiting for the right moment, the right opportunity, the right conditions. And while waiting, you disconnect from the only place where any real shift can happen, the present. Not because you're lazy or unmotivated, but because your attention is pointed forward, towards something that hasn't arrived yet. So even when something does show up, you might not fully step into it. You hesitate, you question, you hold back just enough to stay consistent with the identity of someone who is still waiting. This is how the illusion maintains distance without you realizing it. And it gets even more subtle. Hope often disguises itself as patience or trust. You tell yourself you're being calm, that you're allowing things to unfold. But underneath, there's still that quiet expectation that something needs to change before you can fully settle into yourself. That expectation creates pressure, even if it's gentle. It keeps your nervous system slightly activated, slightly leaning into the future. And as long as your system is leaning forward like that, you're not fully grounded in the present moment where alignment actually happens. Because alignment doesn't come from wanting something to happen. It comes from embodying the state as if it is already part of your reality. And this is where the shift becomes uncomfortable for many people. Letting go of hope doesn't mean becoming negative or giving up. It means releasing the emotional dependency on a future outcome. It means no longer needing someday to feel complete. It means stepping out of the waiting room and into a different way of relating to time. But without something to replace it, the mind resists. It asks, if I'm not hoping, then what do I hold on to? And that question is important because it reveals how deeply this pattern is wired. You were never taught an alternative. You were taught to remember the past and hope for the future, but rarely to engage the present in a way that feels real and stable. So when hope starts to loosen its grip, it can feel like there's nothing left to guide you. But that's not actually true. There is another way to relate to what you want. One that doesn't depend on distance, waiting, or lack. A way that doesn't keep you suspended between not yet and maybe someday, but instead brings that experience into something your system can recognize now. And it begins with a shift that feels simple, but changes everything. Learning how to stop hoping for your future and start remembering it. The only escape from this illusion is to replace the scarcity of waiting with the certainty of memory. Your brain and your cells cannot distinguish between a real physical experience and an intensely imagined emotion. Instead of painfully longing for tomorrow, you must close your eyes and remember your successful future with such clarity that your body feels absolute peace and gratitude right now. This is not about pretending or forcing yourself to believe something unrealistic. It's about using a capacity you already have, but have been applying only to the past. You remember moments that already happened, and your body reacts as if they are happening again. A simple memory can change your breathing, your posture, even your mood within seconds. Now imagine turning that same mechanism in a different direction. Instead of replaying what is behind you, you begin to access what is ahead, not as a fantasy, but as a structured emotional rehearsal. If the future already exists within the larger framework of time, then what you call imagination may be less about invention and more about connection. But the key here is precision. Most people try to visualize what they want in a vague way. They see images, they think about outcomes, but they remain emotionally distant. There's still a subtle sense of, this is not real yet. And that distance keeps the illusion intact, because the body does not shift its state. What changes everything is not the image, but the feeling. When you remember something meaningful from your past, you don't just see it, you feel it. There's a familiarity, a naturalness, a sense that this belongs to you. That's the quality you are aiming to access, but directed toward your future. Not excitement that feels unstable, not desire that feels like reaching, but a quiet, grounded sense of completion. At first, your mind might resist. It may say, this hasn't happened yet, this isn't real. And that's where most people stop. They treat that resistance as a signal to go back to their usual way of thinking. But that reaction is part of the conditioning. Your system has been trained to associate reality only with what has already been experienced through the senses. Anything outside of that is labeled as imagination. Yet your body responds to both in similar ways when the emotional intensity is strong enough. So the practice becomes less about convincing your mind and more about guiding your body. You begin by removing the pressure to get it right. You're not trying to create a perfect scene. You're allowing yourself to step into a moment where the outcome already exists. It can be simple. Sitting somewhere after everything worked out, finishing something that once felt distant, having a conversation that confirms a shift has already happened, and then you stay with the feeling that comes from that. Not rushing it, not analyzing it, just letting your system absorb it the same way it would absorb a real memory, the sense of relief, the absence of tension, the quiet confidence that nothing is missing anymore. That feeling is the signal, and over time, as you repeat this, something subtle begins to change. Your baseline state starts to shift. The urgency that once drove your actions begins to soften. Decisions feel less reactive, more natural. You stop chasing in the same way because internally there is less distance to close. This is where the illusion starts to lose its hold, because if your body no longer feels like it is waiting, then your perception begins to reorganize. You notice different things, you respond differently, you become less attached to immediate outcomes because your internal state is no longer dependent on them. And this has practical consequences. You might find yourself taking actions that feel more aligned, not because you forced them, but because they make sense from this new state. You might say yes to something you would have ignored before, or step away from something that no longer fits. These are not dramatic changes, but they shift your trajectory over time. There's also a growing sense of stability. Instead of being pulled back and forth between hope and frustration, you begin to operate from a more consistent internal ground. And from that ground, your ability to recognize those subtle signals, the ones that guide you, becomes stronger. Because now, your system is not overloaded with noise, it's more receptive. And when that receptivity increases, the connection between your present and what you once called your future becomes more tangible. It stops feeling like a concept and starts showing up in small, real ways. Moments that align, conversations that open doors, timing that feels precise instead of random. Not because you are controlling reality, but because you are no longer out of sync with it. And as this alignment deepens, something even more interesting begins to happen. It's not just your perception or your decisions that start to shift, but the way your external world responds to you begins to change as well. By anchoring this feeling in the present, all the anxiety of waiting dissolves, giving way to a deep and comforting inner peace. You begin to emit an electromagnetic signature, so powerful and identical to your goal that it compels matter around you to reorganize. Events, people, and money begin to align in miraculous ways to reflect what is already real within you. That description can sound exaggerated if you take it too literally, but there is a grounded way to understand what's happening here. Your body is constantly sending signals through posture, tone of voice, micro-expressions, attention, and decision patterns. When your internal state changes, those signals change with it, and other people, situations, and even your own perception respond to those signals in real time. This is where alignment becomes visible. When you are no longer operating from tension or lack, your behavior subtly shifts. You listen differently. You speak with less hesitation. You stop over-explaining. You become more precise without forcing it. These small changes affect how others respond to you, often in ways that feel surprisingly smooth compared to your previous experiences. It's not that the world suddenly becomes perfect, it's that your interaction with it becomes cleaner. And this creates a chain reaction. A conversation goes better than expected because you're not carrying the pressure of needing a specific outcome. That interaction opens a door you didn't plan for. You notice it because your attention is not locked onto what's missing. You act on it with less doubt, and that leads to something else. Step by step, things begin to connect in a way that feels almost intentional. From the outside, it might look like luck. From the inside, it feels like coherence. This is what people often describe as things falling into place. But what's really happening is that your internal state is no longer in conflict with what you say you want. The signal is consistent, and consistency reduces friction in how reality unfolds through your choices and interactions. The illusion loses power here because it depends on that internal conflict. It needs you to want something while simultaneously feeling that it's not here. Once that contradiction fades, your actions stop carrying mixed signals. There's also a change in how you handle uncertainty. Before, uncertainty felt threatening because it meant you might lose time or fall further behind. Now it feels more neutral, even slightly open. You don't rush to close every gap immediately. You allow certain things to develop without forcing them, not out of passivity, but because you're no longer reacting from fear. This creates space, and in that space, better decisions tend to emerge. You might notice that you're no longer chasing every opportunity. You become more selective, not because you're trying to be strategic, but because some options simply don't resonate the same way anymore. The ones that do tend to feel clearer, lighter, more direct. That clarity is part of alignment. It doesn't remove effort, but it removes unnecessary resistance. You still act, you still adjust, you still face challenges, but the internal struggle is reduced. You're not fighting yourself at the same time. And that makes a measurable difference. There's also an interesting shift in timing. Things that once felt delayed begin to happen with less build-up. Not instantly, but without that long stretch of frustration in between. It's as if the path between intention and result becomes shorter, or at least more direct. You spend less time stuck in cycles that go nowhere. This can feel unfamiliar at first. You might even question it. Part of you may look for something to go wrong simply because you're used to things being harder. That reaction is normal. It's the residue of the old pattern still trying to interpret your experience through the lens of the illusion. But as you continue to operate from this new state, that doubt begins to lose strength. Not because you force it away, but because your direct experience starts to contradict it. You see that when your internal state is stable, your external interactions become more effective. When your attention is not consumed by lack, you recognize options more quickly. When your body is not tense, your thinking becomes clearer, and all of this feeds back into your sense of alignment. It becomes less about trying to control outcomes and more about maintaining a state that allows outcomes to emerge in a more coherent way. You begin to trust this process, not as an abstract idea, but because you can observe its effects. And as this trust builds, something else starts to happen. The boundaries between what you thought was you and what you thought was out there begin to feel less rigid. Not in a mystical sense, but in a practical one. You start to see how your internal patterns and your external experiences are constantly influencing each other. It becomes a two-way interaction. And when that interaction becomes more synchronized, the experience of life itself starts to feel different. Less like a sequence you are trying to manage, and more like something you are participating in with increasing precision. Which raises a deeper question. If your internal state can influence what you perceive and how you act, and that in turn shapes what shows up in your reality, then where exactly does the separation between you and your future begin to dissolve? Synchronized coincidences begin to occur daily, proving that you have stopped fighting against the hands of the clock. When you bend space-time in your favor, pulling the coordinates of your ultimate fulfillment into the present moment, you realize that true manifestation never required brute, exhausting effort, but the correct emotional alignment. At first, these moments seem small. A message arrives exactly when you were thinking about someone. An idea comes at the precise time you needed direction. You walk into the right place without over-planning it. None of these events feel dramatic on their own, but together, they create a pattern that is hard to ignore. It feels like life is responding to you, not in a way that breaks the rules of reality, but in a way that suggests you are no longer out of sync with it. The friction you used to feel, the delays, the missed chances, the constant sense of almost, begins to fade. In its place, there is a kind of quiet coordination. This is where the experience becomes deeply personal, because you start to notice that these moments don't happen when you are tense, rushed, or trying to control everything. They show up when you are more settled, more present, less attached to forcing a specific outcome. It's as if alignment creates a condition where these connections can surface more easily. And that changes how you interpret your life. Instead of seeing events as isolated or random, you begin to sense continuity. One moment leads to another, in a way that feels connected, even if you can't fully explain it. You don't need to label it or turn it into something mystical. You just recognize that something is different in how things are unfolding. The illusion starts to break down further here because it depends on separation. It depends on the idea that you are here, your future is somewhere else, and time is the distance between the two. But when these synchronized moments happen, that distance feels thinner, almost like different layers of your experience are starting to overlap. You might notice this in your decisions. Choices that used to feel heavy now feel more obvious, not because you have all the answers, but because there is less internal noise interfering. You're not debating endlessly between fear and desire. You're responding to what feels coherent, and coherence has a certain simplicity to it. It doesn't mean everything is easy. It means things make sense in a way that doesn't require constant effort to maintain. You act, and the action feels clean. You move, and the movement doesn't feel forced. Even when something doesn't go as expected, you adjust without the same level of resistance. That flexibility is part of the fusion. Because what's really happening is not that you are controlling outcomes, but that you are no longer locked into a single rigid way of experiencing time. You're not stuck in the mindset of now versus later. You're engaging with the present in a way that already includes what you once thought was separate from it. And this has a stabilizing effect. The urgency that used to drive you begins to dissolve. Not because you've given up, but because you no longer feel like everything depends on immediate results. There's a deeper sense that you are already connected to where you're going. That connection reduces the need to rush. You begin to trust timing in a different way, not as something you wait for, but as something that emerges through your alignment. You still take action, but it feels more like participation than struggle. You're not trying to force the next step. You're recognizing it when it appears. And when you follow that recognition, things tend to flow. This is where many people misunderstand what's happening. They might call it luck or coincidence, but those words don't fully capture the pattern. Because it's not just that good things happen, it's that they happen in a sequence that makes sense, given your state. Your internal alignment becomes the thread that connects them. And the more consistent that alignment is, the more stable this pattern becomes. It's no longer a rare experience. It becomes part of how you move through your day. Not perfectly, not without challenges, but with a noticeable difference in how those challenges unfold. You stop feeling like you are reacting to life from behind. Instead, you feel like you are meeting it in real time. This is what creates the sense of fusion, not between different dimensions in a literal sense, but between different versions of your experience. What you thought was separate begins to feel integrated. The future you were chasing no longer feels distant. It starts to feel present in how you think, how you act, how you respond. And from that place, something important becomes clear. If this state can be accessed, if this alignment can be maintained, then the fear of time itself begins to lose its grip. The idea that you are running out of it, or that you are too late, starts to feel less convincing, which leads to a deeper realization. If time no longer feels like an enemy, then what does it mean to actually master it from within your own experience? Only those who master the illusion of time can re-experience their future now. Only those who understand this secret abandon the war against days and take control of their own material reality. The panic of running out of time disappears, replaced by the unshakable calm of someone who has already read the last page of their own story and knows with absolute certainty that their victory is inevitable. This calm is not loud. It doesn't need to prove anything. It doesn't rush or force outcomes. It shows up in the way you move through ordinary moments, how you respond when things don't go as planned, how you handle silence, how you make decisions when there is no external pressure guiding you. Because mastering the illusion is not about controlling time, it's about no longer being controlled by the way you were taught to interpret it. Before, time felt like something you had to fight. You measured it, feared it, tried to outrun it. Every delay felt like a loss. Every mistake felt like something that cost you part of your future. That constant tension created a subtle panic in the background of your life, even when nothing was visibly wrong. Now that panic begins to dissolve. Not because your life suddenly becomes perfect, but because your relationship with time has changed. You no longer see the present as a stepping stone to somewhere else. You begin to recognize it as the only point where anything real can actually happen, and that realization shifts everything. When you are fully anchored in the present, your attention is no longer split between regret and anticipation. It becomes available, clear, responsive. You notice more, not because you're trying harder, but because you are no longer distracted by the constant need to get somewhere. This is where mastery becomes practical. You start to make decisions from a place that is not rushed. You give yourself the space to see what is actually in front of you, instead of reacting to what you think should be happening by now. That alone changes the quality of your choices. You also begin to trust your timing, not in a passive way, but in a grounded, observant way. You act when something feels aligned, and you pause when it doesn't, without immediately labeling that pause as failure. You understand that movement is not always visible, and that forcing action just to feel productive often leads you back into the same cycles. The illusion loses its urgency here. It can no longer convince you that every moment must be maximized or that you are constantly behind. Because your experience is no longer based on comparison or external timelines, it's based on direct awareness of what is happening now and how you are engaging with it. And that awareness brings a different kind of confidence. Not the confidence that comes from knowing every step ahead, but the confidence that comes from knowing you can respond to whatever appears. There is less fear of making the wrong move, because you are no longer trying to secure a distant future. You are working with what is real in front of you. This makes your actions more precise. You waste less energy on things that don't matter. You recognize when something is out of alignment sooner. You adjust without turning it into a personal failure. Over time, this creates a sense of momentum that feels natural, not forced, and that momentum reinforces your trust. You begin to see that when you are not resisting time, things unfold with more coherence. Not perfectly, but with less unnecessary friction. You're not constantly correcting yourself or trying to recover lost ground. You're moving with direction. There's also a deeper shift happening beneath all of this. The version of you that once felt distant, the one who had everything figured out, who had already achieved what you wanted, no longer feels like a separate identity. It starts to feel like a natural extension of who you are now. Not because you've reached some final point, but because the gap between now and later has narrowed. You're no longer chasing that version. You're expressing it, moment by moment, through how you think, how you act, how you carry yourself. And the more consistent that expression becomes, the less relevant the idea of time feels in defining your progress. Because progress is no longer something you measure by distance. It becomes something you recognize through alignment. And once you reach this point, something important becomes clear. The power you were looking for was never in the future. It was always in your ability to access and stabilize this state in the present, which leads to a final question that changes how you move forward from here. If this moment is the only place where alignment, clarity, and action truly exist, then how do you begin to use it, consistently, as a doorway instead of treating it like something to get through? The extraordinary life you desire is not a reward you must bleed and suffer for in the future. It is a vibration already available to be accessed right now. Break the cycle of illusion that keeps you tied to yesterday and afraid of tomorrow. Take a deep breath, claim your true creative power, and choose to live the majesty of your future in this very moment. There is no hidden door, no perfect timing you must wait for. This moment is the only portal of power you will ever have. The more you stop chasing and start aligning, the more life begins to respond in ways that feel natural and real. If you made it this far, write in the comments, "I choose to live my future now." This is how I know you're truly applying this. And if this resonated with you, watch one of the videos on your screen right now. If you want to go deeper and support the channel, consider becoming a member. Exclusive content is coming soon.